Hi everyone, my name is Joel Targett. I am a software developer and the creator of Airline, which is an online implementation of the OGP Airline Safety Assessment Mechanism, or ASAM. A little bit about myself. I'm based in Australia. I have over 10 years experience with the ASAM, both as a full-time airline assessor and a software developer. I've created 3 software programs in the last decade based on the ASAM, the latest being Airline, which I launched in 2018 as a third-party subscription service for the resources industry. I think I have a fairly unique perspective when it comes to the ASAM, as I'm approaching it more of a software developer, end user, database administrator point of view, as opposed to strictly an aviation expert. It's an excellent mechanism to work with. However, there are a few issues you come across when creating software based on the ASAM, which I'd like to discuss with you today. For starters, when you get a large ASAM database, say across the 500 or even 1,000 airline mark, it gets very difficult to keep that data up to date. There are so many variables you've got to keep track of on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis that it can quickly grow out of control. Shortly, I'd like to show you my approach for that with Airline, and we'll get to that shortly. Lastly, the single and multi-sector journeys, which is outlined in section 6 of the mechanism. There are additional ways you can calculate risk for an airline for an entire itinerary, both internationally and with multi-airline flights. I'd like to show you a live demonstration of Airline later in this presentation where I go through that. For starters, we'll talk about the question I get asked very commonly: why are no two ASAMs the same? Every single system, whether you use a third-party system or an internal system, will have different scores for every airline. Now, the mechanism is quite stringent and it is straightforward mathematics, but there are reasons why the scores are different. For starters, not everyone's using the same data. Depending on your data source, some are a little bit better than others. It will come into your assessments, trickle down, and cause scores to be different. Secondly, there is different subjectivity and different approaches that people have when doing their assessments. I'll give you an example, is the OF5 minor accidents. I find them a little bit difficult to determine sometimes whether they should be an OF5 or whether they should be excluded altogether. Like bird strike, for example. Unless you know the monetary value of an accident and how long an an aircraft was grounded for, it's very difficult to know whether it should be included or not, and everyone's going to have a different approach to that. Also, there's the conduct of operations. If an airline has passed an IOSA, you can give them a high rating. If they're on the EU ban list, you can give them a low rating. But everything in between is up to the assessor itself. So they can have a bit of subjectivity there. Likewise for security, CF5 and AF8. And also CF4, which is climate and terrain for your country factors. We only assign a single value for an entire country. And when you're talking about a large country like Russia or the United States or Australia, it's very difficult to have a single number that covers the climate and terrain of the entire continent. So that is also one of the more difficult things. Everyone's going to have a different approach to that, and hence different scores between the systems. Lastly is the value, which I find most difficult to determine, is flights operated in the last 10 years. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no third-party service that just straight up gives you that number. You actually have to do the calculations yourself. The mechanism states you should use cycle data, which is what we're using. However, it's not a simple case of looking at the fleet today and timesing it by 10 years. You actually have to look at the fleet composition every day of the last 10 years, figure out the cycles performed by those aircraft, interpolate for the aircraft that don't have any cycle information, then you can bring it all together and calculate that number, which also obviously goes into your safety factors and will give you a score. No two systems do that the same way, so hence there will never be two systems that have the same airline scores. Now, it's not the end of the world. The only 2 times I can see it being a problem that none of these scores line up is that if you're shopping around, if you want to look at different systems, and if you do decide to make a move, you're probably going to have to update your guidelines and your score thresholds. Secondly, if we're in a forum like this, for example, and one company's saying the airline scores 5.0 and says it scores 6.0, they're both sort of right, but it's very difficult to actually make an assessment on an airline if everyone's got different scores. So that's just what I've encountered making 3 different systems in 10 years. As I was mentioning earlier, if you have a large database, once you start breaching the 500 airline mark, for example, these are some of the variables you need to keep track of daily. Whether a new accident happens or an old one expires, whether an airline joins the IOSA program or has left the IOSA program. If your fleet changes, you're going to have a different fleet average age or even a composition change. And every day your fleet gets 1 day older. So these are things you've got to keep track of. If you're doing it manually, it's quite a challenge. When I was doing it manually, I was averaging about 3 to 6 hours per airline, depending on the system, of course, and the tools you're using, which, for me was around about 480 assessments per year. If you're looking at a database with 1,000 airlines in it, that means it's possibly over 2 years between assessments. And if you think about the climate of this today, an airline hazardous today is quite different from what it was 2 years ago, especially with all the unfortunate groundings and what the industry is currently going through. So those are the problems you have to overcome. Stale data leads to out-of-state assessments. You could do more assessments by adding more staff to the problem, but then it starts to get a bit less economical. And finally, it's inflexible. If the subcommittee today decides to change the mechanism for any reason, want to change a weighing or add a new variable, you then have to reassess 1,000 airlines, and that could take months or even years if you're doing it manually, that is. So my solution to the problem is automation. I let the robots do it for me. I've written a daily script, took about a year to develop. It goes out onto the internet, it looks at all my sources, it detects any changes, imports the data into my database, and recalculates the risk score for every airline in my system, and it does that every single day. The benefit of this is that I could have 1,000 airlines, I could have 10,000 airlines, it doesn't matter, it's all automated. The only system I need to keep an eye on, because I can't write an algorithm for it, are accidents. I need to go and make sure what severity each accident happens every morning, so that's what I'm mostly focusing on every morning, and that allows me to have live assessments, which I'm quite proud of. I like to be quite transparent with my data sources, so Cerium is what I use for my fleet data, my code share data, financial data. I use the ICAO API for my country and IOSA database access. For accidents, the Aviation Herald is an excellent resource, and my travel advisories I get from the Australian, American, and Canadian governments, and that filters into my country security ratings by using an average in all three of those. Lastly, the single and multi-sector itineraries. Of course, when you see an airline score in any of the ASAM systems, that's a singular score for the domestic flight only, using the country factor of just the domicile country of the airline. As mentioned in section 6 of the mechanism, you can also do single sector international calculations when you use the country factor of both the departure and arrival country. So that's something we do on Airline Scope. Now the third one is a little more tricky, is the multi-sector, multi-airline assessments. The mechanism states you can use a combined airline safety and country factors to bring up a brand new risk score for an entire itinerary, and that makes it great for comparing against other flights, other airline combinations on the route you need to travel on. And I would like to show you a live demonstration of that just a second. So here we are. This is a live version of airlinescope.com. We're over 1,000 assessed airlines, almost at the 20,000 assessed accidents mark. I've pop into the menu on the left here. This is where most of your navigation happens. We'll jump into the mechanism, and you can see that we are using version 3.0, which is the latest version released by the subcommittee, which is from issue 418 in 2016. I've published the mechanism here on the site just for easy access. You can click and access any of the individual sections here, just for quick reference point. A bit easier than scrolling through a 64-page PDF file. We have a sandbox down the bottom here as well, so you can play around with various factors and see how they affect an overall score. Show all our working and our mathematics as well. I'll go up into the dashboard. The dashboard is the primary page you see once you log in. You can see the spread of the airlines and the scores they currently show. Recent score changes from the past 7 days. We have an industry news feed on the right here. Have a list of recently added accidents and their spread over the last 12 months and 10 years. If we go back up to the top as well, you'll see the company thresholds and guidelines. Now, as a subscriber, you would set a low threshold and a high threshold score. Anything above the high threshold score would be considered a low risk airline, medium risk, and high risk. We've actually got 3 different criteria as well: whether the airline has an IOSA, whether the airline is on the EU ban list, or all other carriers. So there's actually 9 total criteria in which an airline could fall into, and with those values you then set your own guidelines as to what employees can and can't travel on based on their risk level. All very easy to do on the manager's settings page. We'll have a look at the export section here. So after talking to a few of the subscribers, Obviously, as a subscriber, you get a bunch of end user accounts which you can pass on to the travel department or anyone else responsible for the booking of travel within your company. However, a number of managers still prefer to curate their own list, export the data, edit it themselves, and then email it off, say, once a quarter or once every 6 months. And for that reason, I've created this data export page, which you can automatically select the fields you want, how you want it displayed, what file format, PDF or CSV, and then you can download it. Very straightforward. We also have an embedded list system. Now, for this, you can embed the database directly into your intranet or travel booking system. It shows all the airlines, high, medium, and low grades. And you can also the benefit of that is you don't have to hand out your username and password to your customers. It's always up to date, so it's a very popular system, that one. If you jump into the airline system, you can see we've got 1076 there, exports, and you can request airlines as well that may not be on the list. However, we do our best to get every possible airline assessed because the data's there and it's all automated, so it's not too difficult. Lots of filtering options as well and very quick search functions. I'll give an example of an airline assessment. Ethiopian's one I like to use because it is in a higher risk region of the world and they have had a recent fatal accident. So this is the results for Ethiopian Airlines. We get a favorite system here as well, so you can add the airlines to the favorite for quick access. You can PDF this report as well, so it's easy to distribute within your company. We get a fleet composition here. Here's the results. So Ethiopians currently scores 5.45 out of 10. You could display that as a percentage if you wish, which according to the guidelines and protocols and thresholds that I have set up, makes that a medium risk carrier. For there, you can see the safety factors, airline factors, and country factors, and all the scores, all color-coded, so it's very easy to see where airline is strong and where it is weaker. For example, you can see climate, safety influence, air traffic, security, and those are the particular functions that cause it to have a fairly low score. And your accident, of course, they had the fatal accident with the 737 MAX recently. There's a manual override system as well. So if you have some sort of internal knowledge, whether your company's done an internal audit, and you know that had the results of the carrier, you can override this to a high, medium, or low risk and give reasons. That's very handy because that trickles down to the rest of the site. Your end users will see that an airline is okay or not okay, regardless of the score, and that'll also appear in the exports. Recently, we've also added an expiry system as well, so you can have it for 12 months, 2 months, 2 weeks, whatever you require. International Flight Calculator. This is the single sector journeys we were talking about. So for flights within Ethiopia, the current airline score is 5.45. If you're going to fly to another region of the world on this airline, let's say something like Australia, I know they don't fly there, but we get to see that it is a lower risk carrier by 0.061 lower risk. So that's something that you can play around with. That's using the average CF value of Australia and Ethiopia. Very handy system. And once again, click on the little pop-up and it'll give you a direct access to the mechanism to explain this particular section. Here's our list of accidents and incidents. I'll get back to that in a second. We have a fleet composition, current and historic. Like I said, we need the historic fleet so we know how many flights the airline has done in the last 10 years, which coming down here, I explain how we calculated 716,000 flights in the last 10 years, which feeds into the safety factor value. Coming lower than that, we have AF1 to AF8, fleet age, fleet composition, aircraft equipment, conduct of operations, alliances and code shares, financial standings for the past 10 years, maturity security. We also have CF1 to CF5, regulatory oversight, national safety influences, air traffic environment, airfield terrain, airfield climate, and country security. Like I mentioned, I use the Australian, American, and Canadian government websites to determine a country security rating by using the average of all three. So if we come back up to the accident section, we'll click on that recent fatal accident you had with the 737 MAX. Click on any accident, will bring you to the page with plenty of information about what happened, with a severity rating. I think this one even has a video from our source, which is fantastic. Plus I included a photograph of the aircraft. Lastly, we'll pop into the route search section, which shows us single and multi-sector journeys. An example I like to use is London Heathrow, down to Johannesburg. didn't catch that London Heathrow. Click on that again. There we go. And we'll do it towards the end of the month. And we'll do a flight search. Now this is actually going into a live booking engine, getting actually available itineraries. Will return a one-way price as well, but that's usually not relevant for a business environment as you have your own booking systems. But it will give us single and multi-sector journeys for the entire, so every single option that's available. Let's have a look here. So for a direct flight from London Heathrow to Johannesburg, British Airways has a flight. You can see their score there. Their risk score and multi-sector score are all roughly similar. They are low risk according to the current thresholds I have set up, but every company will be different. Click on Air France here as too, which is a two-stop flight. You'll see London Heathrow down to Charles de Gaulle is a low-risk flight. Charles de Gaulle to Nairobi, also low risk with Kenya Airways. It's the last flight there. You'll see Nairobi down to Johannesburg with Kenya Airways. That is a medium risk flight, determined by the thresholds that I have set up for my company. With those three values, the entire multi-sector score is 5.68. You can also open this flight up in Google Flights if you want to book or see other flight options, but they all should be here as well. So that's a great implementation of this system and does help you determine the safer and less safe routes to travel and the itineraries you can book. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions about Airline Scope, if you want to trial or you want to talk about it over the phone, please do contact me. It's joel@airlinescope.com. I want to thank the IOGP Aviation Subcommittee for having me here today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and I hope to talk again soon. Take care.